Hi, everyone. We're going to try to let everyone trickle in, so we're going to start in a few minutes. Hi, everyone. Thank you for spending your Thursday afternoon with us. We will wait a few more minutes so that everyone can get in. In the meantime, please introduce yourself by sharing your name and organization in the chat box, which is located on the bottom right. Please note that all attendees are already muted for the duration of the webinar, but feel free to use the chat box function throughout the webinar. We are also going to monitor the Q&A. So please submit any questions that you might have, especially if you did not already submit questions or you want to submit more questions. We are also live tweeting this on our Twitter page, so please retweet us and follow us using the Immigrants Chicago's hashtag. As a reminder, this webinar is already being recorded and will be available on our website after its conclusion. So let's get started in a few seconds. Please share your name and your organization if you are coming in right now in our chat box on the bottom right, please. We're getting a lot of different folks from representing different parts of the city and different parts of the region. We're going to start in a minute. I think people are still trickling in. All right, we can get started. So good afternoon, my name is Debbie Liu and I'm the Community Engagement Associate at the Metropolitan Planning Council. I will love to be the first to welcome you and thank you for joining us on this discussion about keeping immigrants housed and safe in the face of COVID-19 pandemic and in solidarity with the movement for Black lives. If you're joining us, you probably already know Metropolitan Planning Council, but we are an independent change organization and we've been around for the past 85 years focused on building a better, bolder, and more equitable Chicagoland region. This webinar is put together in partnership with Enterprise Community Partners, which is a national nonprofit dedicated to creating opportunities through affordable housing. Just so we know who will be joining us today, we are setting up two polls. One is about, the first one will be about the sector that you are coming from. So please select your result. So the question is, which sector do you work in? Government, community nonprofit, non-government institution, private, philanthropy, unemployed, or other. So we're going to give that a few more seconds and then we're going to end the poll. Ten more seconds. All right. Looks like a majority of people are coming from nonprofit organizations, but also there's a good mix of other organizations also represented. So then the other question would be which geographical area you represent. So let's see. Then you can also fill this in, and this is a multiple choice. So City of Chicago, suburban Cook, Collier counties, or outside the Chicago metropolitan region. All right. Looks like a majority of folks are coming from the city of Chicago, but every other parts, even outside of Chicago metropolitan region, is being represented here today. So please continue using the webinar chat function to get to know each other and pose any questions and other things, but also the Q&A function will serve as a conduit for the questions. So today's conversation is actually the second in the series and is part of an ongoing series to shape an equitable future in response to COVID-19 and the racial uprising as well. As Chicago moves to enter phase 4 starting tomorrow, the effects of the pandemic will be with us for years to come. And we're curious to hear about the various populations and the unique needs and challenges as it relates to housing and other related issues. We'll learn today about what is occurring right now and the gaps in the current system. We'll also use these conversations to help us build back better, a campaign that we are adopting because the normal that we used to know must be reshaped in a way that helps every Chicagoland resident, regardless of their citizenship status, race, or ethnicity. I do want to note that this webinar was originally scheduled earlier this month on June 4th. But in light of recent events, we hope to take some time to address the intersectionality of the issues of housing and community development in the region, as well as the interconnectedness of the immigrant and Black lives movements. While members of the Black community are not a part of the conversation today, we will acknowledge that this is only a part of the conversation to keep all residents in this region safe and sheltered. With that, I will turn this over to Miriam from Enterprise Community Partners to provide a high-level overview of the importance of this topic before we go into a moderated discussion and open Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. Good afternoon, everyone. As Debbie mentioned, my name is Miriam Zook, and I am the Senior Program Director at Enterprise Community Partners here in Chicago. As Debbie also mentioned, Enterprise is a national nonprofit that works on ensuring access to opportunity for low and moderate income households through affordable housing. We have 11 markets throughout the country, and we provide capital, programmatic, and policy solutions. Debbie, could you close the poll? Oh, I can close the poll. Okay, apologies. So I am here to provide just sort of a high-level framing before we get to hearing about all of the great work that our panelists are doing on the ground to protect our immigrant communities. So as many of you already know, Chicago has a very large, sizable immigrant population. About 20% of the metro area were born outside of the country. More than half of those are here in Cook County, and it's about half and half between the immigrant population in Cook County, both in Chicago and suburban Cook County. And this is a really vital population that has really built our communities, a vital part of our society and our economy. When we think about, our immigrant populations, it's important to know that this is not a monolithic community all from one place, right? There's a lot of diversity within our immigrant populations. About 45% of them are coming from Latin America, 30% from Asia, which is the fastest growing group here in the metro area, and about 20% from Europe, 3% from Africa. And here you can see the list of the top 5 countries that where immigrant populations are coming from: Mexico, India, Poland, Philippines, and China. Those are changing every day, as you can imagine. It's important to think about the diversity here in terms of their needs, in terms of providing culturally competent, and especially solutions to ensure the safety and health of this community. Also, about a third of the immigrant population is, we estimate, is undocumented, half of which also live in suburban Cook County. Debbie, could you forward the slide, please? So when we think about the intersection of, the immigrant community and our current pandemic, it's important, and we're going to talk about the why in a second, to know that immigrant communities are especially vulnerable to the COVID-19 pandemic. Looking at data about infection or positive test cases, we know that zip codes that have more than 15% of the population that are non-citizen foreign born, so immigrant population, have twice the rate of positive COVID-19 test cases than zip codes that have less than 15% of their population as immigrants. We don't have information about, positive test cases by nationality, but we also, if you look at the Latino population, we know that the positive test cases of COVID-19 are again about twice the rate as white population. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see this data by zip code area in the metro area, and you can see the high correlation of the concentration of immigrant populations with COVID-19 test cases. Next slide, please. So why do we see this, or why do we know that there is a really high burden amongst this population? And I thought that the framing that comes from the public health and health equity and environmental justice field is really helpful here, with that of cumulative impacts, to really understand why do we see heightened burden in these communities. And the cumulative impacts framework really talks about the overlap between heightened exposure and heightened vulnerabilities. So we know then immigrant communities have heightened exposure to coronavirus because, they're more likely to live in multi-generational households and overcrowded housing, which means they're probably going to need to spend more time outside. They also are more likely to work in essential sectors, such as construction, food service, transportation. So while many of us had, the privilege of working at home, a lot of these communities did not, and so had heightened exposure to coronavirus. We also know that they're more susceptible or vulnerable to the disease for many reasons. So lower access to culturally competent healthcare, higher incidence of pre-existing conditions, and then more likely to work in sectors that are economically impacted by COVID-19, which means they have less resources to address, health issues. Next slide, please, Debbie. And, despite the cumulative impacts, the heightened exposure, the heightened vulnerability, and the heightened rates of this community, we know that they've been excluded from a lot of the federal funding and local programs, especially that are coming from federal funds, right? We know, we're going to hear a lot about this from our panelists, undocumented have been excluded from unemployment benefits and stimulus. Even though a lot of our communities have rental assistance programs, they might require Social Security numbers to apply for them. There have been challenges of applying for the PPP grants. And because of this sort of absence of leadership from the federal level, we have been seeing nonprofits really filling in the gaps, right? And we're going to hear about a lot of the great work here locally on this. So providing mutual aid and hotlines, helping with application supports, et cetera. Next slide. And, intersecting with all of this, again, where we started from when we started designing these series was really thinking about the implications in terms of housing. So how does, housing insecurity increase perhaps vulnerability or chances of contracting COVID-19? And how does, heightened infection rates relate to heightened rates of housing insecurity? And so sort of the circular nature of that is some of what we're going to be talking about today. Next slide, Debbie. Next slide. Great, thanks. So I'll tee us up. So we are going to be hearing about the work on the ground. So I was just giving a very high level context. And so we're going to be hearing about from these four great panelists today. And I'm just going to introduce them very quickly, and then they're going to introduce themselves about their organization, the work that they're doing, and then we will move into question and answer discussion period. So we're going in alphabetical order. First, we have Sari Lee from the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, NAPA. Fanny Lopez Benitez from Latino Policy Forum. Maria Said from, again, National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, and then Fred Tsao from Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. So with that, I am going to ask Debbie to stop sharing her screen, and then we're going to pass it over to Sari to please introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. My name is Sari, and I use they, them, she, her pronouns for the past 2 years. I was the Chicago organizer for NAPOF, the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, and now I've now transitioned into my new role as National Field Engagement Organizer. Just to quickly introduce my organization, NAPOF is the only multi-issue organization in the country that builds power with Asian American Pacific Islander women and non-binary people. We organize using a reproductive justice framework, working on the intersections of repro rights and health, immigrant rights and racial justice, and finally economic justice. And so for me personally, the intersection of housing and immigrant justice is one that hits home for me. I grew up in a working class mixed status family, and we experienced a lot of displacement and homelessness throughout my teenage years, not only because we struggled to pay our bills, but also because of my parents' immigration status that made it hard for us to find housing.
Thank you, Sari. We'll turn it over to Fani now.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Fani. I also use she, her, hers pronouns. And I'm working with the Latino Policy Forum. I'm Civic Engagement Manager. At the Latino Policy Forum, we work on different areas. We're working to improve education outcomes, in particular with a high emphasis in early childhood education. We advocate for affordable housing for everybody. We promote just immigration policies, and we strengthen leadership through a multicultural leadership academy of Black and Brown leaders from the city and the state. We do all this work with the understanding that advancing the Latinx community also advances the shared future of Illinois. Like Sari, like she said, also housing and immigration for me, it's also very, very personal. I also grew up in an undocumented household, and a lot of, most of my teenage years, because I came here from Mexico when I was 13. We have always lived in the suburbs, so we know that now the majority of Latinx folks live in the suburbs. But it's always like your traditional immigrant family moving around multiple suburbs just to find affordable housing, right? And something that my undocumented parents could afford. So I deeply, at a personal level, understand, how difficult it is for our immigrant community to be able to have affordable and stable housing. Thanks for inviting me. Maria.
Hi everyone, my name is Maria. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Also, I'm also a member of NAPOF. I am a resident of Devon, which is primarily like a working class immigrant refugee neighborhood, which is where I live and I work. And I became a member of NAPOF because I wanted to become part of the community. Like these housing issues that everybody in the community faces, my family faces. We've lived in the same building. We are, but we are, I wouldn't say living in the best conditions. And at NAPOF Chicago, we focus our work primarily in Bridgeport and Devon Westridge neighborhoods because these are areas which have majority API populations. While we are canvassing, we approach community members where they are. We knock on doors. We talk to people on the streets. We try to form connections. We try to, build power with each other. And currently, during the pandemic, we are, phone banking, checking up on our community members, trying to connect them to resources. As I started with, like, this is a personal issue for me because, I'm an immigrant. I've been here in the country for 3 years. I've seen how my family lives. I've seen how my other community members around me live. I've seen what housing is like, and I've seen these many issues and I've faced them, and I think these are important. And thank you for hosting this conversation. Yeah.
Right, there you go.
I'll round this out. Hello, everyone. My name is Fred Tsao. I'm the Senior Policy Counsel with the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, ICIRR. We are the state's largest multi-ethnic immigrant advocacy organization. We represent the broad diversity of immigrant and refugee communities throughout the state, both in terms of national origin, but as well in terms of geography. We are driven by a vision of justice and inclusion for immigrants, whether that is advocacy for policies that on the local, state, and federal level that welcome immigrants, as well as participation among immigrant and refugee communities in the processes that help determine the the policies that directly affect our lives. I myself am the son of immigrants from China, both of whom experienced poverty in their youths. Before coming to ICRR, I was also a legal aid attorney for 5 years and worked fairly intensively on housing issues, landlord tenant public housing issues, and so I'd like to say that I'm also somewhat familiar with housing issues, even if even if that's not a specialty of my work at the moment. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to jump into the questions. So what are some of the core issues your community is facing even before and during this pandemic? So we'll start with Fani from Latino Plus C Forum.
All right. Can you hear me? Sorry, I always have to double check because I've been in places where I talk and nobody hears me. Can you hear me?
Yes, people are saying yes in the chat.
Perfect, thank you. So with, again, the main population that we focus on at the Latino Policy Forum is the Latinx community. As it pertains to housing, we know that even before the pandemic, Latinx renters were already severely housing cost burdened. As of 2017, we know that at least 49% of Latinx renters were already paying more than 30% of their income in housing costs, and that was already way too much to begin with. So obviously, the pandemic has made things way more complicated. We also know that before the pandemic, around 69% of Latinx households in Illinois live in multi-generational homes. And a lot of these multi-generational homes are also mixed status households, right? And so one of the issues that we face is that we have a lot of overcrowding. Latinx folks in Illinois are the ones with the smallest square feet per room, per person in the state. And so a lot of it is, of course, cultural, but a lot of it is also financial, right? Like making sure that we have enough money to pay for our rent. And so we know that because of COVID, it's been incredibly difficult for Latinx communities who live in these multi-generational households, to avoid spreading the virus among family members. And also it's been very difficult to protect the older folks in our households who are at very high risk of getting infected. We also know that in 2016, around 33% of Latinos in Chicago were homeless. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to find enough disaggregated data to see what's the situation in Illinois, but for Chicago, we know it's at least 33%, right? And so we know that because of the pandemic, all of these issues are even more, exacerbated now. And so when it comes to the economic side of it, there's been a few Latino-based surveys recently. And so we know that just to put it in context also, right? I mean, we know that 71% of the undocumented population in Illinois is Latinx, and around 17% of Illinois Latinos are undocumented. So when we talk about the undocumented, we are talking about a huge, the majority of them are Latinx. So we know that when a lot of our Latino workers are suffering, by definition, that means a lot of immigrant Latinos are suffering. And so as Miriam mentioned earlier, our undocumented folks and those who live in mixed status households did not qualify for the stimulus checks. So we have a lot of immigrants of all races, ethnicities. Again, in this case, for us, a lot of them are Latinx, who are not able to pay rent, right? Who are having, again, a hard time with that. And so we know that for Latinos, around 60% of the workers earn under $15 an hour. And again, we found in a national survey that one in three Latino households have less than $100 in savings, half have less than 500, right? So we also know that in our Latino immigrant community, folks are already having a really hard time saving just for emergencies. So this pandemic really caught our community off guard, unprepared for being able to pay for this. And so when we know that our households did not get that stimulus checks, we know that, among our community, it's going to be very easy for them to find themselves in evictions. The last thing that I wanted to mention too is that for a lot of our Latino community, and many of them, again, immigrants, they were unable to work from home, and they're unable to work from home right now. So we find a lot of folks who are Latino people overrepresented in construction, around 39% of them, many of them, like 38% of them in food preparation and food service. And this is in Chicago, right? So these are folks who are working in these industries where it was practically impossible for them to work from home. So again, a lot of those is just a summary of the issues that I'm sure there's more, but these are some of the ones that we've seen that directly impact the ability of Latinx immigrants to have affordable housing and stable housing during the pandemic.
And if I could just jump in, and I think between Miriam's slides and what Fanny just said, I think the two of them have covered a lot of what I was going to say in response to this question. But yes, the federal relief under the CARES Act did specifically exclude many immigrant families, particularly mixed status families where there may be US citizens within the household, but if there's even just one person who does not have a Social Security number, that entire family was left out of the IRS economic impact payments. So that meant that millions of people in immigrant households, immigrant-led households, or even households with an immigrant were left out of that federal relief. Undocumented immigrants generally do not qualify for unemployment benefits. So even though the federal government has extended benefits and provided the $600 per week bonus, that's off limits to many immigrants who do not otherwise have a work permit. Now, this, fortunately, people with DACA, people with temporary protected status are eligible for unemployment, but many people who did not have the proper documentation were excluded from that as well. And then finally, undocumented immigrants who are business owners or entrepreneurs may have been able to qualify for PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. However, that's, at least the earlier rounds of that program required connections with banks and financial institutions. And so if an immigrant business owner was largely self-financing or relying on informal networks for financing and not so much relying on, an established bank, those entrepreneurs, those immigrants were going to have somewhat more difficulty in getting their applications in, getting considered for the PPP payments. So all of these combined with just the fact that I think as Fanny mentioned, immigrants are overrepresented in areas that were hit particularly hard by the pandemic, whether it's hospitality or construction or manufacturing, or for that matter, small business ownership, small retail establishments. So all of that combined to inflict a particularly harsh economic impact on immigrant communities as a result of the pandemic.
I wanted to invite Maria to add some context because I know she's been working on the ground as well. So what have you been hearing about some of these issues as they are being faced by people in your own neighborhood, but also in the neighborhoods that you're serving at NAPOF?
I think I would like to echo some of what Fanny said, right? Like that these are not new issues, that these are like the pandemic is exacerbating already existing conditions that are in these areas. Right now we're talking about it, but it's like these are the lived realities of the folks who are on the ground. Like they live paycheck to paycheck. Many new immigrants don't have healthcare. Many people rely on like these free clinics that are, or like charity clinics or low affordable clinics that are in the Devon area, but now they're closed down because of the pandemic. And like the closest major hospital is like in Albany Park. People don't have transportation. People are, afraid of getting on the bus. When one family member gets tested positive, then other family members there's some kind of stigma attached to it. Other family members try to hide it. No one else gets tested. Like there's a lot of issues, and there's like a lot of complexity to why people about why there's such a high, like why Devon ended up being such a hotbed of coronavirus cases. Like as a canvasser, while I was working on the ground before even the pandemic, we were going door to door, and I noticed that many like houses were not in the best condition. Many houses were not up to code, right? And when we talk to people would always just bring up housing and their landlords who didn't fix anything, then they wouldn't have leases, they would pay in cash month to month, right? And there was like a constant threat of eviction. Like when when people would complain to their landlords about something, like for example, my landlord, we ended up having bed bugs in our house, and I called my landlord and I'm just like, fix that, it's the law, it's your job. And he's like, I'm not going to fix it. And I'm like, you have to. He's like, no, then leave, right? And then my immigrant parents like immediately get scared and they back off. And I feel like, I've heard these stories being echoed, right? Like they call their landlord to fix small things, and then the landlord is like, well, if you have such a problem, then why don't you leave? Right? So there is like a lot of fear about that you will become unhoused, and there's a lot of fear because people don't know what the laws are. People, even when they do, they don't know how to access lawyers or how to make sure that the landlords are following these laws. And no one wants to be homeless, and they don't, many immigrants don't have support systems or houses or people they can rely on that can house them. And of course, as we talked about earlier, the essential, many people work essential jobs, especially on Devon. Many people are cleaners or caretakers, medical workers, they are factory workers, they are working under the table for cash payments. And then once they have faced, once after the pandemic, they've faced a loss of income. So the threat of eviction has increased manyfold. And of course, with the like we already talked about the stimulus check and how everyone, couldn't get it, and mixed housings. And of course, as in the Latinx community, like Asian American households are also like generally multi-generational households. Many families live together. And one of the things I've noticed about Devon, I don't know if that's true for much of the rest of the city, but people rent out rooms or like sublet rooms or like little portions in their houses, so that it's not just family members, it's like strangers live with you. So there's like no space for, just to separate or stuff like that. And another factor that was surprising for me is like language issue. Like a lot of people live on Devon, not just because for like cheap affordable housing, but because they can't speak English and they can get by without it in a lot of cases. But that also opens them up to exploitation. Like this one woman told me the story about like how there wasn't a laundry machine working in her entire like 3-building apartment. And when she complained, like she tried to talk to her landlord, but like because she couldn't speak English properly, like he dismissed her, he pretended he didn't understand, like he wouldn't like, just so that he could like just get away with it. And like she felt like it was on her and not on him because her language wasn't good enough. So like a lot of it is because we immigrant women end up feeling like, that they don't have power, or that they are the ones who are somehow, not making their lives better. And and so I think the experience for AIPI, immigrant and refugee low-income women is like many other low-income renters, but it's exacerbated by being new to the US, lacking knowledge, access, and the fear of doing anything that would risk them being separated from their families. So, yeah.
Thank you all for sharing. So the question that we are interested in is like, what are the experiences of the immigrant and undocumented, and what have some of their ability for landlords to actually pay the rent? So I know, Fanny, you mentioned this earlier. Have landlords, and I know Mario just mentioned this, have landlords actually threatened the residents and maybe even illegally evicted folks? Have people been experiencing this in these communities that we're concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's, I think before the pandemic, immigrant communities were already, struggling with evictions. And so this situation, makes it easier for landlords to, abuse the rent, the tenant, right? I mean, there is a new law called the Immigrant Tenant Protection Act that passed last year that makes it illegal for landlords to evict tenants because of their immigration status. And so there is some protection, but I think to what Maria was saying, a lot of it is the tenants not knowing, right, that they have these protections. And so, I mean, there's definitely been more cases. I think, right now we have that eviction moratorium in the state. But yeah, we've heard of, people who are like, no, my landlord told me that if I don't pay by end of the month, he or she is going to evict me. And, one big thing that I see with the immigrant community is that the fear of coming close to courts, of coming close to like, any criminal system. They don't want to be in that system. So instead of fighting back an eviction, they just leave, and so that means they become homeless, or they go live with, tío, tia, whoever, like whoever lets them crash in their home. But so landlords know that, right? I mean, now there's also this, racism going on, right? That if you look brown and you don't speak good English, I assume you are undocumented. That, of course, we know that's not true. That's not always the case. And so there's been cases where landlords have threatened tenants with evicting them because they think the tenant is undocumented, but the tenant is not, right? So the Immigrant Tenant Protection Act, one thing that we want people to understand is that you do not need to discuss your immigration status when you go get, when you have, let's say that you call a lawyer and you're like, hey, I'm getting evicted because the landlord thinks I'm undocumented. Whether or not that's true, you don't have to actually say, yes, I'm undocumented, right? It's irrelevant, it's not needed, you don't need to mention that. And so a lot of people are afraid. In the cases when they actually are undocumented, they think they have to come out as undocumented to be able to get help from ITPA. And so they don't, right? Because they're like, I don't want to tell people that I'm undocumented, so I'm just not going to go get a lawyer. And so that's been a big issue. Another thing too, and we're actually working on compiling a list of lawyers who are able to provide legal assistance for housing issues. Because one problem that we've had is that sometimes I get a phone call from an undocumented person and I send them to, different organizations. And if the organization is federally funded, sometimes they are not able to provide legal assistance for undocumented people who are going through things like evictions, right? So we are compiling a list because we do have organizations who are able to provide support to the renters regardless of immigration status. But it's layer upon layer, right? I think like again, Maria was saying, it's people having language barriers, it's people not understanding the housing policies, they're not understanding their housing rights, because even if you are undocumented, you have housing rights. Housing is a human right? It's a basic thing that you can get. And Illinois has a lot of laws that say that you have the right to affordable, clean housing. And so a lot of it is helping these tenants understand that. But again, a lot of landlords know this. A lot of landlords know that immigrant communities have all of these barriers that they're facing, and so that makes it easier for many landlords to be abusive in those cases.
Fred, you want to chime in and mention some of the work that you've been doing and ICER has been doing around making sure that immigrants and undocumented renters stay housed and safe during this time and into the post-COVID world?
Sure. Much of our advocacy has focused around financial relief. That is making sure that immigrant renters, and for that matter, immigrants with mortgages, are able to keep paying their rent or at least have the resources to keep paying. So, the city of Chicago did in late March create a small fund for renters to be able to pay their April rent. That funding got committed, got designated fairly quickly. We're trying to work with the city to provide additional sources of relief. The city, by the way, has also opened up a more general fund, not just for rent purposes, but for any immigrants who were excluded from the federal relief. We also worked with the state of Illinois on what was also a relatively small fund of $2 million a few weeks ago, to create grants of $1,000 for households who were left out of the federal relief. Again, because this is a relatively small fund, that money got committed to the applicants for the funding pretty much within 48 hours, and those payments, which are going to take the form of prepaid debit cards, should be hitting mailboxes fairly soon. We were also able to advocate, in Springfield for a number of different a number of other appropriations line items, to benefit immigrants who are going to need assistance. In particular, we did win an additional $20 million for the immigrant services line item, which funds a couple of programs that we at ICRR administer, our citizenship program and our language access program. That $20 million it should go toward cash relief. So that should be on top of the $2 million that has already gone out the door earlier this month. In addition, there is funding through the Immigrant Welcoming Centers, which are programs run by the State Department of Human Services. That should be in the neighborhood of at least $30 million going toward assistance for immigrant families. And then probably most germane for this audience and this event is that, thanks to the leadership of Representative Delia Ramirez and many of the other allies in the General Assembly, the state has also appropriated close to $400 million in, specifically for rental and mortgage assistance. Now, that assistance is not limited to immigrant households, but again, because of the severe impact that the pandemic and the stay-at-home order have had on immigrant households, the significant share of Illinois' population that is made up of immigrant-led households, you can imagine that a good chunk of that $400 million is going to go toward rental and mortgage assistance for immigrant families.
Yeah. And if I can add a little bit to that, Fred is absolutely right about that funding. IDA recently released an announcement that this is the Illinois Housing Development Authority, that they are going to be releasing the emergency rental assistance and the emergency mortgage assistance programs in August. And so they're going to be open from August to the end of the year. And as Fred was saying, from what we are told, undocumented mixed status households should be able to apply and qualify for those. We did crunch some numbers because we were interested in seeing what is the need for rental assistance among these mixed status households in Illinois. And so we don't know how many of the households in Illinois are comprised of undocumented folks necessarily, but we do know that there's at least 237,000 households with at least one undocumented member in Illinois, right? And so we also know that the average rent, the median rent, in Illinois is around like $975. And so we wanted to know, right? Like if we were to give 1 month's worth of rent to these 237 households. Now we know some of them did qualify for the stimulus checks, but many didn't, right? And so we know that we're talking about, at least $230 million needed for, 1 month of rent for these mixed status households, which is huge, right? It's a huge amount. And so we did send this proposal to the Illinois Housing Development Authority so that they knew what is the magnitude of the need for rental assistance among mixed status households. And so we did ask, right, for this community to be prioritized. We are told that they will be able to apply. From what I know is for the mortgage assistance program, undocumented people will probably require to provide an ITIN number. But again, the programs are so new. A lot of these details are just coming out. So, we're going to be compiling some of that information and then sharing that with folks in the community. But one of the biggest things too that we see is that there are, like Fred mentioned right now, right? I mean, ISAR and the team, they've been doing great work, right? I mean, getting all these funds for the Welcoming Center, for the, immigrant line item, as, other organizations have worked on that as well. And there's a lot of help, right? But then a lot of our immigrant communities don't know about it. So a lot of it is, again, how do we work on making sure that as all of these programs come out, that we make sure that there's enough information for our immigrant community, that they know that they can apply and that they receive the support to apply for these funds. I mean, one of the things that we know is a big barrier for immigrants to apply for benefits is language, right? A lot of these applications, sometimes, some applications are not bilingual. Some of them might be, but a lot of them are required to be submitted online, and a lot of our folks in immigrant communities are not necessarily tech savvy or don't have access to the internet, and so they rely on paper applications. In just documentation too, right? I mean, for these two programs, the rental and mortgage assistance, we don't really know what is the documentation that people are gonna have to submit to apply for that. So things like an ID, right? I mean, I hope that, IDA is gonna be accepting matriculas, right? Those consulate IDs for the folks who don't have state IDs. I mean, things like that, we just have to make sure that we remove all these barriers for when people need to apply. And then the last thing I wanted to say about that is that there are, aside from these two funds that are, these multiple funds that Fred was talking about, there are existing housing services and housing resources available. Some of them are available to immigrants, not all of them, which is another whole confusing thing, right? As housing advocates and service providers need to figure out which ones are accessible to immigrants based on their status, whether you're a permanent resident or undocumented or visa holder, or there's all these categories. But the other problem that we see is public charge, right? And Fred is more an expert of that than me, so feel free to jump in, Fred. But we know that for public charge, folks are afraid to apply for public benefits, including housing. Because they are afraid of not being able to apply for a green card later. So that's just one more, one more thing out there, that even if folks are able to apply, they're just afraid to do so, right?
I think that's a great segue. I think our next question is, what are the gaps in the current programs and responses, whether that's at the city, state, or federal level, or are there other policy gaps or programs that are missing? I know some things that have already been mentioned is the language and the technology, and maybe just the knowledge of some of these programs being existent. What other resources or what other gaps are there, whether that's in policy or in programs, that you think that we should consider or look at? And I want to invite Sari into this conversation for that question.
Yeah, so kind of like what Maria had mentioned earlier, many immigrant and undocumented families usually pay in cash and or don't have leases. I also see a gap in how we implement housing laws, as like tenants don't know them and landlords don't really do anything. Tenants also, kind of like what we've been talking about, don't have the time or energy to sue, are fearful of going to court and of the legal system. And vulnerable people don't usually have like material resources to pursue legal action. I'm also just thinking about in terms of going beyond programs, policies, and recommendations, just looking at organizing, because that's what we do. Organizing immigrants and refugee tenants is also really difficult. And part of the reason why is because first generation immigrants aren't always in the position to organize and don't have the time or resources. And a lot of times in these cases, trying to survive and fighting for justice seems to be pitted against each other. And I also kind of want to be transparent in terms of the organizing that we do. While NOPOF primarily works with AAPI folks in Westridge, there are also a lot of Black and Latinx immigrants who also live in the neighborhood as well. And I think that's important to name, because any tenant organizing that we do in Westridge needs to be grounded in working together in solidarity, not only with different AAPI communities, including South Asian, Southeast Asian, Southwest Asian, and Central Asian, but also with their Latinx and Black neighbors too. And as NOPOF builds out a local issue campaign around housing, that's something that we also need to be intentional around.
Fred, are you interested in talking a little bit about the public charge aspect of this and other maybe federal policies that have a effect on the state and the city?
Sure. So the most immediate gap is the resources just aren't enough. As we saw from the exhaustion of the the initial city fund and the $2 million state fund, and we anticipate the $20 million that we're getting for the immigrant services line is also going to go fairly quickly. I think Debbie may be hinting at the fact that, many immigrant advocacy organizations have been prodding the federal government to provide more and longer term assistance for immigrant households, immigrant renters, who are still, even as the country reopens, we're still facing the long tail aftermath of the economic shutdown. The House of Representatives has passed a legislation known as the HEROES Act, which would provide $3 trillion in economic stimulus, including another round of economic impact payments. This time enabling mixed status families, families with undocumented immigrant members to qualify for those payments. Unfortunately, the Senate has not taken up that legislation, and it's not really clear what the timeline is for further movement on that. But yeah, to pick up on Fanny's last comment regarding public charge. Public charge is, a longstanding doctrine within federal immigration law that says that someone can be denied a visa or a green card if the federal government believes that that person is likely to become a public charge, that is likely to be relying on the government for basic sustenance. And what this administration has done is put this doctrine on steroids. So prior to this February, when the new rules took effect, housing assistance did not count. Now, public housing, Section 8 vouchers do count toward one being or likely to become a public charge. On top of that, the federal government is also adding all these fairly complicated, but also fairly strict standards with respect not just to public benefit usage, but also income, education, employment. It's essentially created a wealth test for many immigrants, and many immigrants who may in fact qualify for these types of assistance may be deterred from applying because they're afraid of the consequences of either receiving the benefits or even reporting their financial information and financial status to the federal government. So yeah, as Fanny noted, we're already seeing a major chilling effect among immigrant families who in their application rates for assistance, including assistance they are within their rights to qualify for and receive, and yet these are the policies that this administration has chosen to put into effect.
Yeah, thank you. So what do you anticipate will be the aftermath of all of this beyond this short-term relief, maybe even 3, 5, 10 years down the road? What do you anticipate will happen to these communities and the people who are living here now? And maybe Maria can start that conversation.
I mean, when I was thinking about this question, I don't know. Like, my biggest fear is that nothing will change and many of the things will go back to business as usual. But for immigrants and undocumented folks, business as usual means, slow death and suffering instead of a quick one. It means watching your children go to underfunded schools. It means not getting counted in the census. It means No one talks about how large of an undocumented population is Asian American. It means overcrowded housing. It means unsafe living conditions. It means being denied healthcare. It means living with the ever-present fear of evictions. It means going back from being essential workers to minimum wage workers. And it means fearing that our families may be separated. So there's a lot of fear and uncertainty around what would happen, but I guess I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that I see tenants organizing and I see folks banding together to stop evictions and protect their community members. I know there are tenant organizing groups emerging in the Westridge community, which is very exciting for me to watch. I don't think we should hold out hope for systemic changes from a government that seems determined to come up with only like band-aid solutions when we need like wide structural changes. I think the only hope we have is of a better future is like each other and building power and community. And like right now, there seems to be like a momentum going in that direction. And I feel like if that continues, that is a good path to be on.
Sonny, you wanted to chime in on this piece too, about what you anticipate will be the aftermath of all of this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think as we were mentioning earlier, you know, we're definitely going to see more evictions. We heard that Governor Pritzker extended the eviction moratorium through end of July, again, just to make sure that Illinois Housing Development Authority has enough time to roll out the emergency and the mortgage assistance funds. But, you know, I mean, we know there's going to be a lot of undocumented and mixed status households who are just not going to be able to access those funds for whatever reason. You know, they don't apply, they don't know about it, whatever. And so we just know that there's going to be a lot more of these evictions. And we are particularly worried about illegal lockouts, right? And in particular, when police gets involved. You know, because of the historic problematic relationship there's been between the immigrant community and the police, and the historic, you know, collaboration between police and ICE. We know that it's gonna get complicated, right? Now we know that some cities like Chicago have, you know, sanctuary city policies. Again, Fred can talk a little bit more about that, but that's, you know, I mean, we do have the Trust Act in place that it's now at the state level, right, that provides some protections for our immigrants. But then, you know, again, go back to the same thing, right, like folks not knowing what protections are out there for them. And so there's going to be definitely, I think, you know, I think part of what makes it so difficult to see what's going to happen is I don't foresee right now I know there's a lot of people advocating at the federal level for more funding and for some of that funding to make it down, you know, to undocumented communities. I don't know how successful those advocates are going to be. I know the HEROES Act is coming up next, right? And people are continually asking for that to include some funds for undocumented folks. But, you know, absent that funding and absent funding from funders or from other private folks who are able to provide money that can be used for undocumented people, I think our undocumented folks are in for difficult, a lot, you know, for months. I don't think this is gonna end anytime soon. So I know a lot of the advocates are the ones who are, you know, stepping up and being able to provide the rental assistance and help, but I think we're definitely going to have to be very creative about where are other places where we can find funding for rental assistance for immigrant communities. We know that there's some grants like the Emergency Solutions grants, the Community Development Block grant, and sometimes some of those could be used for rental assistance. And sometimes we have undocumented folks who are able to access some of those. when nonprofits provide the rental, those fundings in the sense of as charity, as, you know, type of donation and emergency assistance, right? Providing it as emergency assistance. Catholic Charities is a perfect example of that. It's one of the number one that comes to my mind, right? That have been able to do that. And so how do we get more and more organizations to be able to do that type of work and being culturally relevant and sensitive when they provide that support and that guidance for undocumented communities? But yeah, I mean, again, I think we have to be very vigilant about how evictions, illegal lockouts, potential police involvement, like how all of that could come together and you know, and really impact our immigrant communities negatively.
Yeah, I think that some of the things that we've talked about earlier is building power and working with other communities together to ensure that the things that we're fighting for are being won. So in light of the racial uprising in Chicago and in the nation, how do you see the immigrant movement intersect with the movement for Black lives? And what are your respective organizations doing to move this conversation? And I'll invite Siri to this conversation to kick us off.
Yeah, so I think it's important for us to first ground in the understanding that I think nationally, and I might be wrong in some of these statistics, so feel free to of course correct me if I am, but I think Black immigrants make up less than 10% of all non-citizens in the US. I think it might be closer to 7 or 8%. But 20% of that number are facing deportation, mostly because of the prison to deportation pipeline, and this disproportionately affects Black and Latinx immigrants. And so there's a lot of predatory policing that happens in communities, and so that's also something that I see that's really important to highlight when it comes to these intersections. I think also something that I'm thinking about is that where it's all these issues, as we're kind of saying in this webinar, are all part of the same system. And so for me, immigrant justice also means, of course, abolishing ICE, but that also means abolishing police and prisons, because we need a world without cages, and we need a world where policing, surveillance, and imprisonment is not how we solve issues. It's not how we take care of each other and and make our lives better. I also think that for the immigrant justice movement, a lot of the wins that we've made, a lot of the immigrants who've have been able to come to the US would not exist, would not be here without Black liberation movements, particularly, of course, as we can see with the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, and also with the civil rights movement, fighting against racist housing laws. All, kind of the reason why a lot of non-white, immigrant and undocumented folks are able to live in the suburbs. I also think in terms of what NOPOP Chicago is doing in order to address these intersections of immigrant justice and also Black liberation, is having conversations with our predominantly non-Black API immigrant base, and grounding ourselves in this analysis around collective liberation, that organizing our communities to dismantle anti-Blackness and for Black liberation also means when we organize our communities to do that, we also are going to be addressing the systems of oppression that disproportionately affect Black women, Black immigrants, Black trans and non-binary people, Black disabled people face, and through that we can achieve liberation for everyone. And finally, to fund any kind of city response, local response, federal, I think it's important to have tax reform and also, of course, to build revenue, as there's a greater and greater need for public support. But I also think that, defunding the police would mean more money to invest in communities and to fund housing, healthcare, and other life-giving resources as well. And so I'm indebted to Black abolitionists, and particularly Black youth in Chicago and across the country, who've been making these demands for decades. And now we're finally seeing the fruit of their labor with mass mobilizations and cultural shift on a scale that we haven't really seen before, to make another kind of world possible.
Fred, what is your perspective on this? What do you believe will be what is ICER doing, and how do you see the immigrant movement intersecting with the movement for Black lives?
Okay, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I feel qualified to follow Siri. That was so powerful. Um, let me start by saying that the combination. I mean, the pandemic, you know, you know, revealed a lot of the underlying cracks in the current system, whether it's healthcare access, disparities in healthcare access, disparities in income, disparities in access to affordable housing, you know, all these different things. You know, I go back to one of Miriam's slides, you know, where she has the map, you know, matching up COVID cases with immigrant populations, and notice that a lot of the communities that have lower immigrant communities but higher COVID cases are heavily African American communities. So this is a common struggle among immigrants and Black communities, you know, and then you know the murder of George Floyd and the resulting protests have only added to the level of consciousness that people across the country are now trying to aspire to with respect to their awareness of racial and economic justice issues. I take heart from what Maria was saying regarding tenant organizing in West Ridge. I think that is super important for all of us to organize among ourselves, try to build and identify the power that we each have individually, and that we can build up collectively, and to try to find voice, both within the systems that already exist for political representation, whether that be the census or elections, but also trying to build up organizations to affirm our own voices, and reach more broadly outside of the systems that exist. With respect to what ICRR has been doing, for a while we have strived to build relationships with Black-led organizations and to try to identify common ground, again, whether it's related to healthcare or or income support, or other issues that are of common interest. We do have a number of African diaspora organizations within our membership, but we also through relationships in organizing world have developed relationships with organizations that are Black-led, that may or may not be so focused on immigration issues, but are similarly striving to achieve social justice. And the killing of George Floyd and the resulting uprising has only accelerated that push. We are in the week afterwards, we conducted a listening tour of our membership, and in order to identify where people are within our membership. As I noted, our membership is incredibly diverse, and some groups, some neighborhoods, some organizations may be experiencing things differently from others. But we want to be able to know that. We want to know who has already been working on these issues and may have resources that can be shared among our broader membership. To be really blunt about it, we also need to identify anti-Black racism among immigrant communities, which exists, and see how we can address that among our own. But kind of more long term, we want to be able to build up a vision, build up a common platform for advocacy that that tries to achieve a vision of justice and full inclusion. Many of the elements that Siri mentioned, particularly decarceration, and over policing, and ultimately abolition, are things that we are striving toward as well. So we're looking forward to the fight ahead of us. We know it's going to be challenging. You know, as Maria said, you know, it's easy to fall back into the status quo. So it's going to be a challenge for all of us to prevent that from happening.
Sonny, do you want to add anything in regards to the Latinx population and the intersection of Black lives?
Hi, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, first and foremost, I mean, the number one thing that we want to work at Latino Policy Forum with our Latinx community is to work on our own anti-Blackness, right? I mean, there's a lot of anti-Blackness in the Latinx community that, of course, we know comes from years and centuries of colonization and being raised, internalizing, you know, a lot of the ideals and sentiments of white supremacy that, you know, make us as Latinx, as brown people, believe that, you know, Blackness is bad or inferior or not worthy of rights or worthy of resources and support. And so we also have to realize that we have a lot of Black people in the Latinx community. There's a lot of Afro-Latinos, but it's often a population that is invisible or just, you know, again, because of our own, you know, anti-Blackness, we don't discuss that. That's so, I often find that, you know, in order to work on bigger social change, we have to start with ourselves. And so, you know, that's something that I think all Latinx folks have to do internally, individually. And then, of course, you know, coming as a collective and working to make sure that we are true allies and accomplices to our Black brothers and sisters in this struggle. We know for housing, right? I mean, we're all on the same boat. At Latino Policy Forum, we have our Multicultural Leadership Academy. Has been running for years, and so that we use that space as a space where we can have these African American, these Black and Latinx community leaders come together, learn from each other's experiences, and also learn to do coalition building. And so once they're done with the Leadership Academy, you know, of course, they often continue working together, or they go to their respective fields and come with this new awareness, right, of even if I am Latinx, in the work that I'm doing, what am I doing to uplift and support, you know, Black communities? And so I think we would like to continue working with this Multicultural Leadership Academy to make sure that the folks who come from that group are also working in the issues that the Latino Policy Forum works in: education, housing, immigration. You know, we found that all of these issues are interconnected. I think whether or not you believe in defunding police, whether or not you believe in defunding ICE, the reality is that we have a lot of evidence. There's a lot of evidence showing that there's a lack of investment in Black and brown communities. In housing is obviously at the top of one of the top things in the list, right? And so I really invite other folks, in particular those of us who work in policy, to be very serious about analyzing, right, our policies and our data, because we need to, again, right, whatever your belief is around that, I think that we need to stop ignoring evidence. Like we need to really look at how are we spending the money, and how is that money then, right, serving or not serving our communities. I think something that I haven't seen around that much, and that I think it's imperative, you know, it's very important that we do, is looking at the intersection between housing and criminalization, right? What is that? We need to evaluate how the criminalization of immigrants and how the funding that we're using, funding the criminalization of immigrants, what impact does that have on the housing rights and on the housing stability of immigrants? And then in turn, what impact does that have in the stability of the whole state, right? Because again, all of this is interconnected, right? I mean, when there's lack of funding for housing, there's lack of funding for education, there's lack of funding for many other services. And so that doesn't just impact undocumented people, that impacts everybody around us. Because we have, again, like we mentioned throughout the webinar, we have a lot of mixed status households, right? there's a lot of households with U.S. citizens being impacted when their undocumented parents cannot access a lot of benefits. So I think at the forum, we are seriously, wanting to work on, and we always work on equity, making sure that our policies are equitable and serving Latinos and other people of color equitably. But that's going to require a lot of very honest and brave conversations, and a lot of questioning anti-Blackness in our own community, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone for sharing all these powerful testimonies and stories and examples. I'm going to pass it over to Miriam. She's been vetting some of these open Q&A, so she's going to take it from here. Miriam, you're muted. At this time, I want to invite all the speakers to turn on their video.
Thanks, Debbie. Can you hear me now? Yes, great. Okay, I want to thank again everybody for, again, your amazing testimony, and also for people for sending in your questions. So one of the first questions that came in was about ordinances for the sanctuary city and other ordinances that how do they result in protections in practice, especially when immigrants don't know about them? So what are we doing to really on education and outreach? And I would add into that, like, especially in this time of COVID, like, are we door knocking? What are you guys doing to address social distancing? And how do we really outreach at this time when obviously information is so important? So I'm going to pass it. Let's maybe if Maria or Sodi want to start.
I can go. So basically what we do, our work mostly is phone banking. We're just calling folks, and we work like on a case-by-case basis. Like we talked about so many policies or so many actual, rent assistance and stuff like that, but people don't know. So we call people, and then people talk to us and they tell us what their problems are. And then we try to connect them. We might help them fill out forms, or we might, just like on the call, just like on a case-by-case basis. Like we're not a direct service agency, but we can help like build community with our members, with our community. So that's what we're doing, which I think.
Yeah, and oh, actually, Fred, you can go.
Okay. Well, I just want to be clear what I hate using the term sanctuary city, so I'll use the term welcoming. What that term actually means. It pertains basically to city government, or and how they interact with ICE or immigration and customs enforcement. So, and some of these ordinances take the form of not inquiring about immigration status, or not qualifying, city services or city benefits on immigration status. Chicago has had such a policy in place for 35 years, since Harold Washington. Others are somewhat more ambitious with respect to, cutting off, any kinds of, communications or interactions with ICE, or not obeying ICE warrants if presented to their police forces. Chicago largely has these elements in place as well, though there are certain exceptions that we're still trying to remove. But yeah, as Laura, the questioner, points out, many people just might not be aware that these ordinances are in place, or they may be confused as to what the policies actually are. And part of the reason I don't like the term sanctuary city is that it seems misleading. It gives you the impression that the city is an ICE-free zone, when in fact we know that ICE operates in the city somewhat with impunity, actually. I mean, they're free to come and go and make arrests, at people's houses or businesses within the city limits. So it's really important to note that that is not, it's not the case that just because the city passes an ordinance that ICE is barred from conducting operations here.
It kind of relates to some other questions, and we heard you guys talk a lot about the fear that's pervasive in this community, right? Like, even if we have protections, you know, are there other ways that, you know, people feel vulnerable and wouldn't want to ask for aid because of that fear? And so there was a question, you know, it was related more to the public charge question, but in general, right, if they're affected by public charge, are they going to seek emergency Medicaid or mortgage assistance? Do they understand, like, that they can access lawyers? Or when you have an illegal lockout, you know, you might be scared to ask the police. So kind of curious about, what do you recommend to people? What kind of outreach are you doing? Yeah, how do you address this sort of pervasive fear that is very justified, it sounds?
Well, I'll start directly with respect to public charge, and I did respond to the questioner privately, but I'll just state this for everybody else. Part of the problem with public charge is that it is so confusing, and so many people who do qualify for benefits or who should not be affected by the public charge rule are still afraid to seek out assistance. Two particular points with respect to that question. Emergency assistance, whether it's cash or or housing assistance, does not count toward public charge purposes. It does not count as a public benefit for those purposes. And people who already have green cards should not trip up against public charge again. Public charge only kicks in if you're applying for a green card or applying for a visa or otherwise applying for admission to the United States. The one circumstance where someone with a green card is going to trip up against public charge is if they leave the country for 6 months and then try to come back in. So the lesson from that is don't leave the country for more than 6 months. But again, there's a lot of education we need to do that we've been trying to do among our communities, in that regard.
I can add to that a little bit. From what we heard, when it comes to emergency assistance, we were told that it was safe for undocumented immigrants right now to apply for the emergency rental and emergency mortgage assistance, right? So a lot of it is that, right? Like, I think folks understanding when it's emergency assistance versus when it's assistance that is going to be given to you, consistently, right? And that's when the public charge gets triggered. I mean, we have even heard of, there's townships over here in the suburbs that sometimes are able to provide emergency assistance. And depending on the township, sometimes undocumented folks might be able. But again, as long as it's emergency, and it all depends on the township, it's not the same everywhere. So yeah, I mean, we've been telling folks if it's emergency, because of COVID-19, you should be safe for now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one of the questions kind of asked about, again, like, the nervousness about, like, if they're going to be reported, any connections to ICE. Are there, is there any thought about creating sort of like one safe agency, or does each community sort of have their community-based organization to reach out to for these things?
I've seen a lot of folks doing amazing work, but it's you see the organizers, right? I mean, you see your cities, your Marias, like doing all this amazing work with their mutual aids, with help. I mean, I know this is not shocking, but I wouldn't be surprised if what the organizers are saying to people is stay away from the cops. Don't open the doors, don't call them, don't go see them. I'm not surprised, right? And I tell my folks, stay away from the police. So I think there has to, and again, I'm not claiming that nothing is going on. I know a lot of organizers are doing this work. I think a lot of it is how do we amplify the voices of these organizers, amplify that work so that it can be used as a model that could be replicated in many, many cities, right? Because one of the main issues is, the folks who live in communities where there's no organized movement, right? Where there's no immigrant organization serving them, when there's not enough, I mean, you know, organizers can only do so much. There's only specific geographies where they can be. They cannot serve the whole state. And we have undocumented folks all over the state, right? So how do we replicate a lot of those mutual aid, a lot of those, you know, neighborhood tenant protection models that a lot of organizers have been done for years, right? I mean, I know a lot of this started with Black people. Black folks were, you know, have been starting those models from years ago. So, you know, how do we also, as people in policy and folks who, you know, funders, man, funders were the money for these organizers, right? We need the funders to come and give these organizers more of that funding so that they can replicate, because a lot of this work is being done voluntarily, for volunteers, right? So these volunteers, these organizers need the money so that there's alternatives to immigrant folks, so they don't have to call the police.
Thank you, Fanny. We are out of time. I want to first thank our panelists, first and foremost, for doing such amazing work and really supporting our immigrant communities. And we really appreciate you taking your time. So thank you, Fanny, Maria, Fred, Sadie, and thank you, Debbie, for co-moderating this panel with me. Just a reminder to everybody that we will be posting the recording online on the MPC website. And want to thank you all again so much for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.